Hello, I'm Susie Miles. I'm a lecturer at the University of Manchester, and I was commissioned to develop the topic guide for DFID on inclusive learning. Prior to this task, a lot of the literature and the focus has always been on inclusive education. And we thought it was actually a stroke of genius that we're talking about inclusive learning. And that fits in with current international discussions, the post-2015 agenda. How can all countries improve learning, this England included actually. But particular concern about the approximate number of 250 million children who are failing in school. So this guide focuses on the needs of children aged 3 to 12. It starts with a general overview of the out of school children challenge, the sort of global situation, situating that in a discussion about inclusive growth. And it then tackles some of the really thorny issues, the contested issues related to inclusion and disability and difficulties in learning. We've tried to avoid the terminology of special educational needs, which is very much a sort of Western discourse, although it is used a great deal obviously in developing countries. But it's used in different ways across the world, and so we've tried to emphasize that a considerable number of children in all countries have difficulties in learning at different ages and stages of their educational journey. But in addition, of course, there's a significant minority of children who have significant disabilities, who obviously need a very specialist approach and additional support in order to be able to learn. So we've tackled that in the second part of the guide in order to set out the stall, in a sense, of these issues that are contested and a bit confusing and often off-putting for educationalists who feel, oh, this is a specialist area and it's not something they have expertise in, and they don't have resources and they don't have training, so therefore this issue isn't tackled. And then we go on to present evidence that's been collected focusing on low-income countries. A lot of literature reviews in the past have focused on the world, and the evidence there is dominated by evidence collected in primarily US, UK, but certainly in the post-industrial nations of the world, where a great deal of attention and resources are paid to the issue of special educational needs and difficulties in learning. Difficulties that are often not diagnosed or identified in many developing countries. And so we'd like to argue in a way that this is possibly the first time that there's been the bringing together of research evidence on inclusive learning for children aged 3 to 12 in low-income countries in this way. So in a sense what we're presenting is nothing terribly new. It's just that evidence has been very scattered in the past and produced in different formats. And the evidence, or rather the emphasis of research over many years has been on access, attitudes and advocacy. So there's been, especially from a disability perspective, you know, since the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a very strong advocacy lobby arguing for the rights of that group of children. And arguing for them to be allowed access to school. So the emphasis on access and rights. And so there's been a neglect of what actually goes on in classrooms. And of course there are huge numbers of children often unidentified in classrooms, or children who have been supported to get into those classrooms by advocacy groups, but you know, who are having real struggles to achieve in those inclusive learning settings. I guess I should say at that point that, you know, although the title is inclusive learning, we're not making a claim that the evidence presented is of inclusive learning. It's of the journey towards promoting a greater acknowledgement of difference and diversity, and that includes disability, so that we can move in the direction of inclusive learning. But obviously that in a sense is an aspirational goal. It's not necessarily achievable in that sense. And then the final section looks at the relationship between inclusive learning and inclusive growth. Now this is a tricky area in the sense that, rather like a lot of the evidence presented in the third section, it's scattered, it's flimsy, it's difficult to make great claims about. And in a sense, there's more counter evidence for the cost of not including very large groups of children in education, rather than the evidence that this is actually contributing to inclusive growth. So there's a very mixed body of evidence there. Yeah, I'd just like to say a little bit about an issue of teacher education, which has come out very strongly in the section on evidence on inclusive learning. I think because there's been so much emphasis on access, gaining access, on advocacy, on rights, there's been less attention on what actually happens when children gain access to school from marginalised groups, and in this case children with particular difficulties in learning. There's quite a lot of evidence on visual impairment and physical impairment, and you know, it's unsurprising in a way. They are the most visible, the most obvious in the classroom, and arguably the most straightforward solutions, although, as Paul Lynch has said, you know, that getting prescribed spectacles in a remote rural area is extremely difficult. One of the pieces of evidence we found was from China, and 1/3 of parents who were offered spectacles for their children had refused them because it would bring stigma. So the idea that spectacles are associated with stigma in a middle-income country like China is quite disturbing, really, and gives you an indication of how far we have to go to address more significant learning difficulties and/or disabilities. So one of the findings really was that there's a very fragmented approach. I think partly because there has been a tendency for a separate form of educational development for children categorised as having special educational needs, or being vulnerable or at risk. And so, and in the case of disability, in many countries they come under the social welfare department or the health department, as they did in England until 1970. And so there isn't the responsibility of the Ministry of Education to see all children and all children's learning and the high quality of that learning being the responsibility of the Ministry of Education. And so what's happened is that a lot of the NGO sector has moved into that vacuum and provided facilities, and the issue of visual impairment and blindness has had great prominence in that. And so huge numbers of competing almost and unaccredited forms of education for teachers have emerged, and that has led to, well, fragmentation and a lack of consistency and national agreement about what teachers need to know. And a lot of that training is impairment specific or focused on a particular educational difficulty, rather than addressing the needs of what all teachers need to know in order to teach classes in inclusive ways, or teach all the children who come to their class. And that involves inclusive pedagogy, teaching strategies. I think we've got a long way to go before there will be good evidence in that area of work. But you know, there's some promising signs anyway.